Hello, and welcome to From Dawn to Decadence, a Regrettable Century and Varnblog co-production that we do about every 6 weeks. Last time we made a bunch of predictions about Decadence, and then a bunch of shit happened that we were absolutely wrong about. So we didn't have war in Venezuela, but they did take Maduro. Who knows what the hell was going on there? I still haven't figured it out.
Yeah.
Something like 32 Cubans were killed and like 70 Venezuelans. So
we did commit a war crime.
Yes.
Without really having much of a war.
And I can't remember if we predicted, I think we predicted he was going to threaten war and not do it because he'd been threatening it for a year and just bombing boats. The most pathetic form of state-sanctioned murder I can think of, since there's no evidence that they were engaged in any crime whatsoever, and it should have been province of the Coast Guard. But we're not here to talk about the news, although there's plenty of decadence to go around there too, as Trump just got his tariffs handed to him by his own Supreme Court. Seems like government may be in shutdown again.
I mean, that is one of the funnier developments, the tariff stuff.
And also obvious, like, is a right-wing Supreme Court not going to like support capital? Duh.
Right, like they're siding with their class over the buffoon that leads their class, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, nominally anyway. He's the one sitting on the throne
so far.
Who knows? Every day I see left, I think we're never going to have elections again. And I'm like, well, I mean,
I think we definitely are.
Yeah. I think they're going to be I think they're going to be a mess.
Yeah.
But you know,
like, okay, so like you lived in Egypt before. I lived in Turkey. Like, we know what it's like to live in a managed democracy. It's much more stable, much more normalized.
We live in Texas now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I live in Utah. It's also pretty similar.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, look at have you seen the Texas like congressional districts map?
Yeah.
It's some wild shit. Like, I've seen some insane gerrymandering, but there's one that goes like from Houston, I mean, not Houston, from San Antonio up in the rich outskirt areas, and it just hugs the corridor all the way up I-35 until it gets to Austin, and then it goes back into Austin, but neglects the formerly, not so much anymore, poor areas of Austin, and just hugs around the outside of Austin for all of the rich areas, and that's a congressional district.
Yeah, so I am in the same congressional district as St. George. Now that's actually been ended, but it's the Republicans are trying to reverse it through very sketchy attempt at getting signatures to reverse the popularly passed referendum. But for you who don't know, St. George is literally on the border with Nevada. I live north of Salt Lake.
Oh, well, yeah, that's insane.
Yeah. We should have, I mean, we should have only one, but we should have one Democratic district for the congressional map, and we don't.
Yeah. If we had regularly drawn maps that just were by geographic area, we would be probably just be a blue state, because all of the population centers generally are blue.
Yeah.
You know.
That's actually not true in Utah. Utah is this weird thing where we have urban conservatives because of the influence of the LDS Church.
Because of the municipal theocracies there.
Yeah. Although the Utah is no longer majority Mormon, which is going to make that even more interesting.
Oh, wow. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yep. That's the problem with having an economy that's worth a shit, is people come to it.
The libs descending like locusts.
But yeah, so as far as theories of decline, though, we're talking about Aufheben's essay. God, when was this essay written? I'm guessing
In 2005, so I believe it came out somewhere before that.
1993 and 1994.
Oh wow, yeah.
Wow.
All right, so
Years ago, 33 years ago. Wow.
yeah. It makes sense a little bit more when you put this in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union and
the end of history.
And also how bad people were at predicting economic cycles between 1950 to basically 2007. There were economic cycles. We still had a business cycle, but like everybody was kind of bad at predicting it, and it was always less severe than the Marxists were claiming. I mean, Trotsky famously predicted the end of capitalism after World War II was over.
Yeah, that's why James Cannon said, obviously the war's not over because capitalism still exists.
Right.
And for some reason, he was allowed to stay the chief.
He was allowed to keep saying things.
Yes.
I mean, to be fair, the Soviets thought that too until like 52.
Yeah. Stalin was always preparing, leading up to the Second World War. He was preparing for a war with the West, not Germany, but the capitalist West, and thought that the war with Germany was just an interlude, that the real war was going to be coming soon, and that was the real Second World War to Stalin.
And he thought that actually because of economic predictions. I think people actually need to like remember that.
I mean, he was kind of right. Like the Cold War is a version of that, but not quite what he was thinking.
Well, sure. So just to remind people of the core thesis of the Aufhebung articles, and it's a series of 3. You guys have talked about them before. I have read them a few times. And they argued that decadence, which I think it's interesting that they use decadence, because the only people who call what they are calling decadence and not crisis theory, breakdown theory, which aren't really the same thing either, but real subsumption theory, which is how it gets picked up later on by endnotes, etc. That pretty much it was only the Council Communist successor organization, the ICC, which used the term decadence for this. So automatically, it just talking about this as a decadence theory strikes most people who aren't in the ultra left in the 70s, 80s, and 90s even as off. We've already talked about that multiple times, but I do think we have to deal with it. Aufhebung was basically arguing against, what other groups like the various neo-Kautskyist and a lot of Trotskyist Leninists would say. We would call it economism, right? Yeah. Negative economism as opposed to positive economism or Bernsteinism. So negative economism, sometimes mixed up with accelerationism, but it's a theory where breakdown theory is another one. People like Kuhn, who repopularized Henrik Grossman, and Ted Reese, who's kind of picked it up after that, are big on breakdown theory. But Aufhebung argued that this was just an excuse used by various left groups to deal with why the revolution hadn't happened yet, just like the mysterious "why hasn't the revolution happened the way we predicted" question, which I almost, and I think, God, it would have been almost 15 years ago now, where I was going to write an article called 15 Ways of Looking at a Lack of Revolution, of which I included like most of the Maoist stuff too, like labor aristocracy 1, they didn't do it. Labor aristocracy 2, the West didn't do it. Labor Eversocracy 3, Whitey didn't do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And believe it or not, I think there's actually some merit to every one of the theories, which tells you that they don't really explain much. If I can find a reason to defend all of them, and this is one of them. The other thing that they said is that the capitalism, we didn't do much about it because it would automatically collapse. This was the normal critique of breakdown theory that you hear thrown at Grossmanites. This essay traces this back to the end of the Second and then to the Third Internationals. And it really plays a lot in volume 1 on the forces of production and relations of production as interpreted by Lenin and Luxemburg, to mean that capital after 1914, which is weird that it's a date that has to do with the World War. But, you know, when we talk about our socialism, our barbarism stuff, 1914 has to come up over and over again. That's when we chose barbarism and not socialism. And so much that any choosing was to be had. And most decadent theorists hold that after this point, capitalism has become a fetter in human progress and no longer has a progressive character. Which also may agree with, but not for economist reasons. Yeah. Aufhebung then goes on to critique the objective seemingness of these ideas, since they keep on making predictions that are wrong, which also fair. They sure as hell did. And we'll get to some specific ones. And thus they downplay the importance of revolutionary subjectivity and building consciousness amongst the working class. And then they also pick on traditional decadence theories, which assume the goal of socialism is just to unleash the productive forces that capitalists are just stifling.
Yeah.
And Aufhebung almost sounds like proto-degrowthers in this, although I will get to how theory communists and some other left communists responded to them in the beginning. Now, that's the broad summary so that we don't go through line by line. I'm now going to summarize parts 2 and 3 very, very fast. Parts 1 had to do, it broke it down into the following categories. Okay, they talked about Trotskyists and left communists. They kind of left Maoists out of it because I get the feeling that the Aufhebung guys don't consider Maoists Marxists.
Yeah.
And the reason why is New Democracy and like the idea that the peasantry was the most revolutionary class. They would, you know, to quote William Vollmann of all people, that's Mao pouring acid on the bones of Marx.
Jeez. I mean, and also there's like some seriously class collaborationist aspects to Maoism that are, I don't know, just very hard to reconcile with Marxism.
Sure, but it is kind of odd that if you like, I just did like a search, like a control F on the parts 1 and 2, and the word China and the word Mao just don't occur at all.
Nope. Yeah.
Which is funny because like I remembered this, but I didn't mean it. I didn't think it was literally the case. It's not just that they act like that's not really Marxism. It's like they act like that doesn't exist.
Yep. Which is weird.
Yeah. Weird.
Since by 94, I mean, the 90s are when China neoliberalizes the most extensively. Even China defensists like Adam Tooze and Jason Hinkle have been pointing that out recently, and they actually sound like Deng Pinghan on Deng Pinghan on Deng now, which is that Deng was actually a really big regression. Which is interesting because I'm wondering if they're sounding that way. Is that because the Xi's government is about to turn on Deng? I don't know. But it'll be interesting to see. I
wonder what. Yeah, that will be interesting to see. I can't imagine what that would gain Xi politically, but you know, I'm not as familiar with the inner workings of you know, I guess there was supposedly a coup attempt on Xi recently.
Yeah, that does not seem to be the case, but
it does
whatever.
not. Yeah, it seems like he did purge some generals though.
Yeah,
but
I will say this about G speculation. Twitter's becoming a wild place for it, and even I've been fooled by people sharing stuff and then asking Chinese speakers if it has any basis and them going no. And I don't just mean anti-Chinese, I also mean pro-Chinese, like supposedly China was going to stop investing in Israel. Right. That didn't happen. It was based off of a misreading of a lawsuit by an Israeli company that produced no evidence for the claim. So it wasn't totally made up, but it wasn't what people were saying.
I think it was a big case of that's definitely what people wanted to be the case.
Hell, even I wanted it to be the case.
Yeah, me too. I also want that to be the case in like Denmark and in Turkey and in everywhere.
Right. So in the first part of the Aufhebung, I said they talk about the influence on left communists, which they say that this theory of decadence tended to reduce their political activity to purely propagandizing the decadence of capital and standing aloof and waiting for economic chaos to make the working class receptive to their message. And I will say that I don't know that left communists do that much after the 1970s. So maybe there's a point here. It seems like to me all I see them do is argue with each other, and not even with other Marxists who they will just call the left of capital and not even engage with. So
right.
And then Trotskyists who, while involved in day-to-day struggles, still operate on the assumption that capitalism was in the death agony. And I find that interesting too, because I think that would have been true in 94, and it would have been true for a lot of the Trotskyist groups that kind of fizzled out in the 80s. It was not true for the Cliffites.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there is a point to the fact that, you know, I don't know, for some reason I've been trying to figure out, why did the British Trotskyists come to America and like survive here when all the American Trotskyist groups pretty much, they didn't die, but they stagnated to the point of like almost non-relevance in the 80s.
Or they just turned into tankies groups.
Yeah.
Or, well, I mean, that's how they got relevance again. Like,
you remember the 90s the 30s in slow motion thing?
The 1990s are going to be the 1930s in slow motion.
Yeah.
And I don't remember whose formulation that was. I feel like it was Michael Kidron, who's in the ISC, in the British SWP. And I don't remember what his argument was.
That was wrong.
He's very wrong.
Yes.
In fact, I can't even figure out what fucking element of society would that even be parallel to.
No, the 1990s was the biggest explosive growth of capitalist production everywhere. Because of the neoliberalism of China, the opening up of a whole huge, a fifth of the Earth's surface to new investments.
And major extraction from both the former Soviet sector and Africa.
Yeah,
like the complete looting of the former Eastern Bloc by Western corporations.
Yeah, it turns out that it was actually the exact opposite of what they said it was.
Yeah. Although somewhat consistent with weirdly with both Kautsky's super imperialism and Lenin's imperialism, you wouldn't think it could be consistent with both, but it is, in that you saw imperialists cooperate with each other to cannibalize the former Soviet Union. And then also that create a boom in markets, even though trade with the Soviet Union was never particularly high. It wasn't like, Western companies were getting rich there exactly. It just altered the game of play enough that you had new markets to grow into. But nonetheless, it's weird because it is kind of consistent with some of the stuff that Aufhebung is critiquing in the Second and Third International, but I still get why this would make sense if you're looking at Trotsky as talking about capitalism's immediate death agony, because they're just repeating the transitional program predictions by Trotsky, like they're whipping themselves to it and wearing hair shirts. And
yeah, it's funny because I think a lot of people that kind of forget, or else they don't know, that the transitional program is the name of a document, and its formal name is the death agony of world capitalism.
yeah,
That's what it's called. The entire, first of all, I like the idea even, but it's predicated upon a prediction, a conception, a method of analysis, which turned out to be just not true. It just turned out to be wrong. And Trotsky wrote that, when he was alive. He didn't write it afterward. So,
oh yeah.
so it's been a
That'd be
long
something.
time since it turned out to be incorrect. Like a very,
Yeah.
very long time.
So it's interesting that you have the various breakdown theories that come about Kautsky's, Luxemburg's, and Lenin's. Bernstein's initially a breakdown theorist, then he becomes a different kind of economistic thinker, which is the evolutionist. But weirdly, they're both actually forms of economism. Lenin's, I think, not actually as economistic as this article accuses him of being, but I don't really want to go into all that today. I do think Luxemburg is, though. What they say is, ironically, the breakdown theory allowed for reformism to flourish because socialists felt like they could just, wait and do reforms while capitalism just fucked itself. And ironically,
that would even make a little bit of sense if they didn't also then manage austerity regimes when capitalism started to slow down.
I was about to say, then they actually do manage the austerity regimes themselves. See Hilferding as finance minister and having to be saved by Mack, who was later on become a Nazi. So, good luck on all that. So that's theory one. That's kind of my summary of part one. I'm going to summarize part two, where we get into what I call keeping score with the ultra left, or I'm more ultra than you, haha. And they go on socialism or barbarism, particularly on Cornelius Castoriadis. And they do like that SRB tried to deal with the fact that capitalists have managed to stabilize the economic crisis through Keynesianism. But they said that SRB, in rejecting the idea of economic laws altogether, which also people like Barron and Sweezy kind of did too with their monopoly capital, claiming that we no longer lived in an era where the business cycle was going to matter, was wrong, and it messed up class analysis, which I actually do see with socialism or barbarism. Socialism or barbarism goes weird in 1,000 ways. I mean, it kind of leads to left populism. It leads to negationism, which is all the people who decided that the Popular Front was bad, therefore the reason for the Popular Front was bad, therefore no Holocaust.
Socialism or barbarism being the group discussed in the which I don't think we haven't mentioned them in 6 months at this point. So just to anchor what we're talking about here, not the concept.
It's a French group of ultra leftists who were a mixture of council communists and Trotskyists, I think.
Right.
Initially.
Yeah. That was Sartre's foray into Marx. I don't know if it was his first one, but he was a part of it for a while.
He was, he went through there before, I think, ending up in more consistently Maoist circles. I think their most famous person is Cornelius Castoriadis, and then the people who ended up around Mouf and Leclau later on. Yeah. Then there's the situationist. Of course, he Benlaitsky de Boer, or what did they say? He resuscitates the subjective spirit of Marx, which I'm like, okay, whatever.
I mean, I to a certain extent, I kind of think it's not entirely true, but it's kind of true, actually.
SI is attributed, at least in this essay, of saying that the proletariat would not revolt because of poverty, but because of alienation and boredom, and then attributed that to the society of spectacle. Aufhebung jumps in on that and says that the revolution is the negation of the system, not merely a more efficient way of running factories, but then doesn't really explain why the spectacle would do this. And I don't think Aufhebung believes it will either, but the Situationists did, and it didn't make a lot of fucking sense.
Right. I do think that the Situationists did think so, and I do think that's incorrect.
Yeah.
Our local Situationist defender has weighed in authoritatively on how they were incorrect.
I think that if the PCF was a better organization, which made room for people like the Situationists, and if the board was less intolerant and sectarian, then Situationist critique, which was a kind of sort of a revival of, but a one-sided revival of the subjective, because I do agree with that. I actually think that could have been really, really useful, but instead
there's so much in Society and Spectacle, and particularly on comments on Society of Spectacle, that are useful if someone had developed it properly, but none of the Situationists did. They all went off and did weird shit.
Yeah,
like Raoul van Eyck became a right winger, right?
Yeah, kind of. And
he kind of became an anarchist, which also did make it allow him to be kind of a right winger, but still maintain his like overarching critique, because he's libertarian in his ethic, which is
right,
sort of right wing.
Anarchism means you just do whatever you want.
Yeah,
that form of anarchism, anyway.
Yeah.
And I feel like the rest of the situation has just ended up doing art shit, frankly.
Yeah, I think mostly that's true.
Then
After
we get into
most of them kind of just like disappear from political life.
Yeah, we get into Operaismo and Autonomia in part 2, which disengages with Tronti and Negri. Tronti is always, to me, the more interesting of the two, because Negri becomes associated with those obtuse ass, we're going to use postmodern language to just be less populist, and and our theory is actually vague as fuck, and actually just maybe even a little bit like a dumber form of classical new democracy Maoism, but we're not even going to say that because we're going to use really fucking obtuse ass words to, you can tell how I feel about Hart and Negri's book. You guys read which one did you read? Empire or Multitude?
I've never read Multitude, but I've read Empire a few times even. Well,
Empire is crazy to me because it's like it was on the fucking New York Times bestseller list, and its actual content can be summed up in like 2 pages.
What's funny is we, in the academy, as a historian, when you're reading Marxist historiography, they include Hart and Negri in that. And I don't think they have anything to offer in Marxist historiography at all. And I don't know why they're included there.
I guess maybe because it was a big book, but I'm like, Hart and Negri were like the even more obtuse form of Mouffe and Laclau, which is basically just left populism forever.
Right.
They like Operaismo because they like the reinsistence that class struggle comes first and the end of substitutionism. And they like that Operaismo and Autonomia like did not think that capitalism declining on its own would drive the system into crisis, but the workers had to push it into crisis. But that's about all that they really get out of that. And this actually starts to sort of, you can tell that Aufhebung is going to be proto-communization, because communizers tend to like use high Hegelian speech, but actually just eclectically borrow from like different Marxist traditions that they like, but without, making them actually make sense together. My favorite is in Endnotes, which takes a shit ton from analytical Marxism, but they're totally speaking in a Hegelian framework.
Right.
It's like,
wow, that's dialectical.
Hell yeah.
And then they turn on Ernst Mandel, who was kind of, late capitalism in the book in the 70s, which asserted this. And again,
and he never really changed. He never deviated from that.
No, but again, Mandel was right about what happened in the 70s. It just didn't seemingly portend the end of capitalism. And then our favorite council communist Grossmanite, Paul Maddox Sr. comes up, and he gets resuscitated in the 1970s from his work in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And Aufhebung likes Maddox more than they like Mandel because Maddox was more sophisticated, but of course they both have mechanical views of the law and capital, where capital act upon the worker instead of being a product of social relations. And they basically imply that Mandel and Maddox are both just like early Stalinists as opposed to 50s late Stalinists, which they don't say that, but they imply it. Okay, this gives me the part 3, and then we can talk about this a little bit before we move on. Okay, part 3. They go after my boy Halil Tickton.
Oh
no. A whole lot of part 3 is dedicated to critiquing Halil Tickton in particular, and particularly the Critique Journal. Tickton argued that capitalism had entered a period of decline where the law of value was partially suspended, but had not been replaced by socialism, leading to a zombie state of permanent crisis and waste. Which,
yeah, fucking, what's incorrect about this?
I mean, the law of value isn't. I think the only thing I would reject to is the law of value is not partially suspended. But
sure.
But I would say that, like, we live in a time of crisis and race where the law of value has been mitigated by over focusing on one counter tendency or another, and that's another thing we have to talk about. Like, the reason why we're not in neo-feudalism is because you still have to have production for all of it to work, and you don't eat off of a bite. But I do, and the amount of land rents increased, but not dramatically. But I do think that there is some truth to the idea, though, that capitalism, because of low profit rates on traditional commodities, has tried to leverage profitability through other means, mostly by using rents and IP law. Sure. So I think that's true. I just don't think it's a new form of production.
So when it comes to the industry that's keeping the world economy afloat right now, like AI and advanced tech, they're attempting to suspend the law of value in order to keep us all afloat. But, eventually that's all going to come collapsing in on
It's already showing severe signs of weakness.
Yeah.
So that'll be fun for everyone.
Folks.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the way, also, I mean, my MMT friends who don't think the bond market matters, that we could just, ignore it. Bond market's how currency has value outside of your own country. And when you don't have a hard commodity backing it, which I think people are just now realizing. And when that goes away, M&T conditions don't exist anymore either. Yay! Because you actually have to start making sacrifices to pay your debts, since your debts are a fucking 33% of gross GDP or something. I don't know. I need to look that up before I say it. People have called me out on overstating our numbers or not contextualizing them. Like when we were all talking about GDP between Ireland and the UK, and people were like, the UK's GDP is fine. And I'm like, no, it's not. And then they're like, well, it's this much more than Ireland. I'm like, adjust for population, because I forgot to say it was per capita GDP. But anyway,
GDP is largely not completely useless, but there are so many mitigating factors that just a surface level look at comparing GDPs is not a useful way to really determine productivity of a country at all.
No, but even then, like you do have to look at per capita for productivity because, of course, large countries are going to have more production. Although the UK is not that large, Ireland's just that small. But
but you have to adjusting for purchasing power parity makes it like more useful. But they don't do that in mainstream economics generally.
No. They also don't separate GDP from productive to just it. There's no difference between stuff that generates profits and stuff that moves revenues around.
Right.
They're both treated the same way, which actually makes it even more impressive that people argue against the decline of the rate of profit, the fall, when you look at GDPs continue to decline relative, even with that bullshit.
Yeah.
So that should tell you something, that they can't even hide it completely with the way we do accounting now.
I kind of can understand why in the long period of explosive capitalist growth in the post-war era, why people might say, oh, maybe there's this tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I can see why they might question it. By the 1970s, certainly by the 1990s, I feel like it's just, I don't understand it anymore. And the fact that there still are people who are unsure about this, but they call themselves Marxist, like I don't understand.
Well, I mean, we also have to remind ourselves that communization in this part of the ultra left is only half Marxist. Like when we get like Aufhebung from the Marxist end, but like communization includes like the Invisible Committee and Kuhn and
right.
And those were anarchists, kind of. Like they weren't Marxists at all.
In all but name, that's definitely true.
So I mean, the series concludes in an interesting way. I mean, if we go to the end of part 3, which I'll just go into, and then we can talk a little about this, and I'll talk about some of the responses I looked up to this too. I'm just gonna. There's some slander on Prabohinsky and Trotsky, but I'll read that. As long committed Trotskyists, there's no problem for Tikhtin for identifying socialism with planning. Indeed, in restating classical Marxism and developing the contradictions between planning and the anarchy of the market, Tikhtin drew heavily on the works of Prabohinsky, who, alongside Trotsky, was a leading theoretician of the left opposition in the 1920s. Prabohinsky, who, with Bukharin, actually wrote the Bolshevik program of 1918, so people remember this, who was first developed the distinction between the law of planning and the law of value as two competing principles of economic regulation in the period of transition from capitalism to socialism. I think it's interesting that everybody fucking dropped that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know anybody who maintained that. But anyway, this is the basis of the distinction that Prabohinsky developed the argument of the left opposition for the rapid development of heavy industry at the expense of living standards of the working class and the peasantry. Because the left opposition, to remind people, the left opposition wanted to out Stalin on the peasantry.
Well, when it comes to collectivization, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, totally didn't go poorly for Stalin. So imagine how if you want to even go faster than Stalin wanted to go. Arguments that were later used to put into practice after the liquidation of the left opposition were starting. For radical chains, which is a group that I didn't even talk about because they don't exist anymore, adopting the notion that we are a period of capitalist decline and consequent transition to socialism in which the principal contradiction is between the law of value and the law of planning is far more problematic. As part of the radical change project is their attempt to reject traditional politics of the left, particularly that of Leninism. This is made clear in the articles, The Hidden Political Economy of the Left, where they resolutely stress the importance of self-activity of the working class and attack on Leninist notions of passivity of the working class and need to be externally imposed discipline. Yet, this is undermined by their adherence to the good Marxism of Tikhtin. As a result, we find that when pressed on the question of planning, radical change position becomes both slippery and highly ambiguous. Their way of vindicating planning is virtually to identify it with self-emancipation. Now, I find this all, I'm reading this because I want to remind everyone of this. I find this all weird that planning is the primary focus. Because one, we live in a fucking economy that's capitalist and planned.
Yeah.
Like, it's weird. And it was heading this way, I think, around the middle of the 90s. So this feels like a particularly dated argument. But also, like, who is arguing that we don't do planning under Keynesian regimes?
Yeah, I've never encountered that argument.
Right?
In
So,
fact,
like,
I've always encountered it as being proof that it's actually just socialism.
right, which it isn't, but
Yeah, of course it's
Right.
not. Like, you know,
Are you sure?
like I remember, like, I've had this arguments with like Young Americans for Liberty, which I don't know if it still exists, but it's back in college.
they're probably part of Turning Point USA now. So.
Yeah, probably. But you know, they would basically say, well, listen, you know, Keynes and his, you know, they really did. They talked about John Maynard Keynes as like a principal theorist of socialism in the 20th century, which I just thought was like the height of fucking ignorance. But
Yeah. However, a whole lot of socialists kind of believe that because Keynesian hybrid Marxists like Doug Henwood exist, and who knows about how many countless fucking M&T hybrid Marxists there are.
So I think Young Americans for Liberty in 2016 folded into like Young Americans for Hitler, and then like they dissolved, and then now the void has been filled by TPUSA.
Yeah. So
Do you remember when all the libertarians turned into fucking pseudo fascists when
Yes.
Trump came to during the
when
Trump...
Stefan Molyneux became a hyper nationalist all of a sudden? I remember. Pepperidge Farm remembers. That was a fucking decade ago now too.
I know, it's so wild. That's
God,
the first time we did a podcast was in 2016, I think. Our old podcast.
is that right?
Shit. Talk about decadence. I've been podcasting in some form since 2012. Since right after Occupy.
That's wild.
That is wild.
I don't think I even listened to a podcast until like much later than that.
I don't think I even encountered the concept of a podcast until like 2015 or 16.
I was a podcaster early because I hated regular media that much. And so I was listening to podcasts like when you had to download them individually onto your iPod.
I remember doing that in like, I don't know, when I was still in the ISO. So it had to have been before 2013. So probably 2008, 9. Remember downloading individual podcasts.
Yeah, that's when I got into it. I was a teacher at the time. And I could hold like 20 of them on my iPod Shuffle or whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway,
shuffling a podcast, that's an interesting thing to do.
all right. Last part in place of conclusion. I think it's interesting because now knowing this was written in 94, because I remember when I read these, I'm like, what's this fucking weird part about radical chains? Who the fuck are they? And now I'm like, oh, I don't know the far left comm groups in Britain in the 90s. Like, why would I? It's like 200 people involved in that at most. So
that's generous, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, in place of a conclusion, is capitalism in decline? Yes, but okay, I can see why you wouldn't think so in 1994. Coming to terms with the theories of capitalist decline have involved coming to terms with Marxism. One essential aspect of Marxist critique of political economy was to show how relations of capitalist society are not natural and eternal. Rather, he showed how capitalism was in a transitory mode of production. Capital displays itself as transitory. Its negation is within, and there is a movement to abolish it. However, the theory of decline is not for us. It focuses on the decline as a period within capitalism and identifies the process of going beyond capital with changes in the forms of capital rather than struggle against them. Decline cannot be seen as an objective period of capitalism, nor can the progressive aspect of to capital be seen as an earlier period now past. The progressive and decadent elements of capital have always been united, which actually this part I think is true. capitalism has always involved a decadent negative process of commodification of life by value. It also has involved the creation of universal class and opposition, rich in needs, and the ultimate need for a new way of life beyond capital. In fact, that last part may be what I might actually somewhat disagree with. I do think there's a class. I'm not sure that class is universal anymore. The problem with Marxist orthodoxy is to see capital's doom not in collective forms of organization or struggle of the proletariat, but in the form of capitalist socialization, of which is a interesting problem that comes up again and again. I've even seen some people bring this up in Marxist Unity Group that like monopoly capital socializes labor, and I'm like, not anymore. It doesn't. Like that's just not true now. It imposes a linear evolutionary model and a shift from capitalism to communism. The revolutionary movement towards communism involves rupture, theorization, decline of capitalism misses by identifying with aspects of capital. As Pannekoek point out, the real decline of capital is the self-emancipation of the working class. Okay, so when you read that conclusion, you think I agree with this essay. But I actually do think it tends to be a little bit too optimistic about what capitalism can do. But that made sense in 1994 because it looked like you had Keynesianism manage the crisis that emerged in the early 20th century until the 60s. Then you had neoliberalism emerge to bring back profits in the late 70s, which it did do, even if those profits were meager.
And it was cannibalizing the basis upon which all previous profits had been built.
Correct. Thus making Hilferding's declarations of finance capital in the early 20th century seem to be true in the late 20th century. And that, that there is periodic restructurings in capitalism, which I think is true. What I don't think is true, however, is like that doesn't mean the decline of the rate of profits to fall isn't real, and it doesn't mean we are in a decadent period of capitalism. Even in the 90s, like what was capitalism doing in the 90s? Even though it was a highly profitable area, and it's like IP law.
Well, looting, and moving around profits to make profits more profitable.
Right. And
it's kind of like what is now being called by some people neo-feudalism.
Yeah. It's kind of like, hey, that's
thing.
always been a structural thing of capitalism, at least going back to the early 20th century when Bukharin was writing about monopoly capital in 1910 or whatever.
I mean, there's a reason why Lenin referred to he called imperialism the latest stage, or what people call now or people translate as the highest stage of capitalism. That's whenever the globe is covered, there's nowhere else to go. That's it. Every single theory about the expansion of capital and the whatever, it's all about the restructuring of existing modes of extraction and the declining rate of profit and the declining the downward pressure on wages. There were brief attempts to like restructure everything, and they kind of work a little bit for a little while, but because of the declining rate of profit, they don't work for very long.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing, actually, if you look at these kinds of restructurings of capital, they seem to be becoming harder and harder to do.
Yeah.
Neoliberalism in one country seems to just be accelerating decline. Like, and that's what post-neoliberalism apparently is like, I mean, it is funny that I'm like, okay, so now our great debate is not whether or not socialism in one country or international socialism. It's now, and how to do international socialism. It's now capitalism in one country or not.
Yeah, like we have to have tariffs on everybody, so that way, hopefully they remove all their production back here. But we can't tell them what to do.
And also, it's not doing that at all. It's actually accelerating the decline of our own production. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Transparently.
I mean, it's doing the exact opposite, because you have to have a, let's call it a nationalist industrial program if you want to encourage and or force production back into your heartland. But
Ironically,
that
it
would
means
mean
that
a different management style that
Right.
none of the ruling class
wants
would allow.
You know what rational Trumpism is? The Biden administration's policy between 2021 and 2023. And I know that's going to piss a lot of people off to say that, but it is. It was trying to reshore slowly with an actual developmental program, blah, 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 blah. It was still at the expense of working class, by the way, which is why all these, everybody becoming we're going to do China smokestack socialism in America is like, you dipshits. You live in a decayed capitalist form. It's not an early capitalist form. Like, those aren't the same thing.
China...
By actual Trumpism, it's really more like if Steve Bannon was somebody who did more than just say the words economic nationalism, he would be advocating for a program similar to that pursued by the Biden administration. Because the actuality of Trumpism is that it is just, it's literally the same thing as
it's looters' capital.
Yeah, it's looters' capital. That's it.
China industrialized through proletarianizing its peasantry and, basic primitive accumulation, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And we can't do that here. It's ridiculous.
Right. That's already been done here.
Yeah. Yeah, it was done here 100 fucking years ago.
Started longer than that ago, 150 years ago is when we began that process. 100 shit.
Basically, in the events right up to the Civil War is when this shit started.
Exactly, yeah.
That's when our bourgeois revolution actually fucking finished.
Yep.
If there is such a thing as bourgeois revolution, ours finished both economically and politically with the Civil War. Anyway,
I've been reading for my PhD comps, and a lot of the stuff that I was assigned to read for nationalism is about how the bourgeois revolutions are all fake.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
I don't think so either, but I don't think it's as cut and dry as very rigid sort of conceptions of revolution that like the vulgar materialist conception of revolution didn't happen that way. But a
undialectical vision.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
revolution from the Second Internationalist and Soviet
Soviet
Stalin era Soviet.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Are real bad at it.
Yeah, but the idea that the bourgeois revolution is completed by the conclusion of the Civil War in the United States, that's also like the position of fucking Karl Marx.
Yeah. I also think the bourgeois. Here's the thing: Orno Meyer's right, for example, that we didn't get rid of our fucking aristocracy in Europe in most places until the end of World War II, and even then, in the places where capitalism started, you still have aristocracy that's pre-capitalist. UK still's got all kinds of pre-liberal shit.
Even still today, right now.
Yeah. Although
no one would ever argue that capital doesn't rule there, though.
Well, what's weird is there are debates in the 70s that say Britain was particularly backward in the mid-20th century because of this. These are the other Brenner debates, which I didn't know about. And the New Left Review in the 70s. So yeah, people have tried to argue it.
There were elements of the British economy that were backward. The way that they organized their countryside was like semi-feudal still.
Wow, so it's almost like it was like combined and uneven development.
Yeah.
I wonder if there was. Yeah. Somebody should write about that sometime.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing: is people always think combined and uneven development ends at national borders, which is
right.
I'm like, are you stupid? Have you been to the Southeast and then been to Seattle?
Yeah, exactly. The whole point, the whole purpose of that as a theoretical construct, that the structure of capitalist productive and distributive relations because of imperialism are already done. So like there's a combined and uneven development of capitalism and the
so
structural
much
level
would have gone better if Otto Bauer had won the nationalism debate.
Absolutely.
Like,
but like that's the theory behind permanent revolution, is that because of combined and uneven development, you will never complete your bourgeois revolution until there's a proletarian revolution. And I
people don't know what permanent
fundamentally
revolution means.
True. Yeah,
they think it means revolution forever, which is not what it means.
It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that you cannot have the revolution, then you have the period of bourgeois development, and then at some point later on you have the next revolution. That's all it means. And that's undeniable, I think. Anybody who thinks otherwise, I just think doesn't really think about revolution other than just that it seems cool.
Or it's something that you do to liberate your nation, which I'm like, yeah, sure. Right. But also like, no. I think the word revolution has too many meanings now. And even in Marxist time, it's kind of confusing because when we talk about revolutions of modes of production, often they aren't political at all.
Right.
Or they're not obviously political. The political comes later.
Right. I think to give it to have a proper understanding of this, we have to think of the bourgeois revolution as both the political shifts that start to happen in like the late 1500s, and the what we call the industrial revolution, which starts to happen even earlier, or certainly whatever. They both happen, and those are both together what we might call the bourgeois revolution. And neither, well, in the political case in England, it's still not fucking complete. And it will never be complete until what we call socialism. That's my lingering. I don't think I'll ever let that go completely. My lingering Trotskyism. It's just never going to go away.
Forever post-Trotskyist.
Yeah. No matter how many posts you add to it, there's always Trotskyist at the end. Post Trotskyist. Or as an eco-Stalinist, I'm a post-Trotskyist. I'm a post-Trotskyist reformed Titoite.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think any of this.
Those are all. That's all. All that shit that we just said is all fake. None of it means anything.
That's none of that shit actually means anything at all.
I was about to say, I still go by this observation by Matt McNair that you can find Trotskyists and Maoists who agree on more than you can find between Maoist and Trotskyist and Trotskyist, and that.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
And that
you can find Trotskyists and Maoists on both sides of literally every debate.
Right. And more so today, that when you find diehard non-Maoist Marxist Leninist, you're meeting people who like don't even know what that means.
Oh,
like I talked to a MMT Christian Marxist Leninist who's like, Stalin's views are vindicated by Michael Hudson, and I'm also a Christian. I'm like, you're an idiot. Like you believe completely. Actually, I shouldn't say idiot. That's wrong. You have worked yourself into the ability to compartmentalize your theories that because they vibe similarly, you believe that they're the same thing.
Right.
Stalin would have had you shot, but I don't know what else to tell you. I mean, every now and then you do. I mean, most of the Marxist Leninists I meet who are serious Marxist Leninists and that they know what Marxist Leninists historically believed, or some weird non-Dungist form of Maoist, of which they're coming back, but they seem to have gone away for about a decade. So
yeah, they're coming back as part of they're the which I guess you can call them the left wing, the left edge of Xi Jinping thought, which is the right edge of it is left-wing Dengism, and the left-wing edge is right-wing Maoism.
Right. And I would also say a lot of it has to do also with sex reemerging within the DSA as opposed to outside of it, because nothing's been done since the end of the end of 70s sectarian Marxism. So
honestly, the last really, really crucial, significant potential development in the world of Marxism as like a distinct political phenomenon was the phone call when Ernest Mandel calls Tony Cliff and says at the end of when Yeltsin declares the end of the Soviet Union, and Mandel calls Cliff and says, obviously there's no more basis for our separation. We need to, kind of get the whole family back together again. And Tony Cliff says, go fuck yourself. That's the end of it. It happens in 1992. It's been a long time, but we haven't yet figured out. We're starting to figure this out, but like, it's all different now. There's no more basis for any of this stuff.
I remember the old ISO people used to tell that story. Like, listen to how cool Tony Cliff was, and I was always like, "What a dickhead! What an idiot!"
Very dumb. Also, weirdly, Tony Cliff, you were able to get over half of the fucking Draperites and Shachtmanites joining the ISO. That's why the ISO existed.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was a split off from the IS, which was a development of Draperites and Shachtmanites when the left Shachtmanites left the SPA because Shachtman was too right wing.
Yeah.
And that created the IS tradition in America, which was a callback to the independent socialist tradition, like in the 30s and 40s. And it had a Cliffite correspondence group that became the ISO.
They affiliated to the IST after they had already been an established sort of Draperite organization,
right? And they were kicked out of the Draperites, which is also weird because the Draper was not in the Draperite organization. Draper went independent 3 years in because he thought that the IS tradition was already a sect.
Yep,
it's all very it's very weird.
It was always funny reading Anatomy of a Microsect in the ISO and not being able to self-reflect at all.
I had when the ISO still existed right before it fell out. I was in America at the time, so it must have been 2017, but it's right before it's about to completely dissolve. Right. Yeah. I was doing a speech with the DSA in New Orleans, which I wasn't back before I was in the DSA. Back when I just worked with them, and I'll probably go back to that stance if things don't change, but whatever. I remember ISO people coming to yell at me about Draper and how Draper couldn't do anything. And I was like, well, you can't do shit either. The best you can do is pivot wildly on whether or not you think tailing the Democrats makes any sense. And your organization is what, 5,000 people? And apparently it wasn't even that. It was 1,000. Somebody told me the other day they think the CPUSA is 20,000 people. It was a Trotskyist. And I'm like, I don't believe you.
I think the CPUSA is probably was 5,000 at the beginning of the 2000s. And it's probably, since all the old people have died off since then, are probably around a much less than that. Well, but no, I mean, the ISO, the biggest numbers the ISO ever had at its peak was around 1,100.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, most of the time that we were in the organization, we fluctuated between 800 and 1,100.
Yeah. The reason why the ISO seems so much bigger is because they had stakes in a historical materialism conference and a history of being affiliated with the IST.
Yeah, right. Also happened to be very, very, very vocal and very loud. So you could.
We did the work. Each one of us did the work of 10 regular Trotskyists.
Yeah. So
the papers, we sold the papers of 10 Trotskyists.
Well, it's interesting to me because I know so many people came through the ISO, and yet ultimately there wasn't that many people in it, which also tells you how many people were just leaving.
Yeah, revolving door the entire time. We were constantly trying to recruit. And our branches, depending on the branch that you were in, stayed about the same size, but never ever kept more than a core of cadre for longer than a year or two.
Yeah.
Let's say my experience with like I've been going to DSA meetings here since I came back to the States, which is almost like 9 years ago now, right?
Yeah.
And now that I've joined, there's almost nobody who is under 50. So the people who are like elders who were like joined in the 80s are still here. But they have gone through like this entire branch of like 250. They might still be in the organization, but they're not showing up to meetings anymore. Like
that's interesting because they're claiming 100,000 members now.
Yeah, they probably have 100,000 members. However, they probably go through 30,000 a year.
Yeah,
the ISO is the DSA is a huge revolving door. Like
this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I believe they're at 100,000. Which is funny because they're now finally at what they were telling everyone they were almost at right at the beginning of the Biden administration.
Right. Yeah.
They lost.
I think they were saying 80,000.
Yeah, they were at 80,000. They lost 15,000 formally, without, and that's in addition to their normal revolving door attrition rate. But as I told someone, there's probably 400,000 ex-DSA people in the United States.
That's probably true.
Like
the largest group on the American left is ex-DSA members, just like it used to be ex-ISO members, just like at one point it was ex-CP members. So earlier this conversation that we were having about what, I said something like I'm an eco-Stalinist, reform Titoist, whatever, post-Trotskyist. It was just funny, whatever. It reminded me of an article I read recently. I wanted to read a section of it. Go ahead. The article is called "New Tankies and Digital Neo-Stalinism." It's Europe Solidaire Sans Frontières. This section goes through bio-abbreviations like Marxist, Leninist, Zapatista, Titoist, Accelerationist, Georgist. Digital militants identify themselves as belonging to one or several left-wing sub-tendencies, removing any kind of historical, geographical context from that identity and ignoring potential ideological contradictions. This type of expression also reflects the fragmentation of the global left, where transformative projects have given way to identities disconnected from concrete experiences of class struggle. And then one more part. The experience of the American left in particular is marked by an absence of real expectations of socialist transformation. I just thought this is like one of the most. It's just so extremely it's just so right on,
Yeah, I just found this, so I'll read I'll link it in the show notes too. The phenomenon of the new tankies is therefore a product of the historical failure of the left. Far from constituting a current movement, they are a cultural expression of aesthetic nostalgia and political resignation. They do not represent the defense of real socialist politics, but merely a postmodern provocation against liberal democracies and their hollow promises. I think that feels true to me. Because these people, well, the one thing I'll say is I go on Twitter and you think everybody's a fucking Stalinist in some way now. And I don't even think Stalinism's a thing, to be completely honest, but everyone's like got mustache man emojis. And
I think that Stalinism was a thing back when the term was first coined by Lazar Kaganovich. But it hasn't been a thing in like a very, very long time.
But I mean, I don't think these Marxist-Leninists are any kind of coherent Marxist-Leninist either. Half of them would get mad. I remember someone yelling at me was like, "You said Popular Front. That's some Trotskyist bullshit." And I'm like, it's literally the opposite of that.
Yeah, it is literally the opposite of that.
And they're not in organizations either. Most of these online Stalinists, they're not in organizations. They don't do activism. They don't do reading groups. They're
in the fucking DSA.
Or they're in the DSA, exactly. Yeah.
Where they're not is they're not in pipe fitters unions. They're not in bus drivers unions. They're not in the places where you would expect to find where you should be able to expect to find the
if they're in unions, they're in like teachers unions and the CWA, which is by far the largest growth union around here, and maybe if you meet radical nurses, although that's not as likely. I mean, the thing that I can tell you is like Yeah, I work with teachers, so I guess they're PMC or whatever. But like they see Marxists fighting on Twitter with fascists, and they think it's teenagers LARPing, and they don't have any idea of what most of the stuff means.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really more like 30-year-olds LARPing.
Well,
also, I shouldn't say that they're not in pipe fitters unions. I'm just saying that they're not. That doesn't matter. That's not part of what they think is political.
We have seen the CP USA like go back to earlier rhetoric around Stalin the way the PSL did. But the weird thing is, like, the PSL, for example, they're not actual Orthodox Marxist Leninists, but you don't know that till you're well in there to the organization.
Yeah. Well, I return to my periodic defense of whatever. I'm also not a CP member, but they are, they are involved in the trade unions for better and for worse.
Right.
They are actually there, and that's.
But then so is the DSA. So.
Well, yeah, and that's more than you can say for much of what we've discussed when it comes to the sub tendencies, whatever.
No, like the ISO was hardly ever involved in unions here, and like the Teamsters
outside of Chicago, outside of teachers, the ISO just wasn't.
Yeah, I tried to be in Texas in as much as we could, but like
you didn't recruit from that though. I mean, and you couldn't have easily either, because I'm going to just tell you, if you have to have an opinion about what the Soviet Union was in 2007 or whatever,
yeah.
Yes,
like
if you've got shibboleths about the fucking Soviet Union,
right?
When you're trying to recruit workers,
well, yeah, like I was a member of the Texas State Employees Union, which is a statewide subset of the CWA, and I did try to recruit for my union, and you know what people told me? I don't have time for this shit, and it's like, you know what? That's fair.
The CWA will complain about the new communists who don't have jobs, but who join their ranks as salters. I will say this. I mean, one of the things that I've seen is people locally, the one of the reasons why the Labor Committee went dormant again in the DSA is all they could think of doing was salting. And I'm like, how are you going to salt a down economy? If people aren't getting jobs, how are you going to get them jobs? To like and all you people post all your fucking shit on the internet, so they're gonna know who you are, like way before you show up. Because if you're ideologically dedicated enough to salt but you haven't been disciplined to keep your mouth shut for years prior, they're gonna know who you. I mean, like, I was just like, what are you even doing? Like, why aren't we trying to expand the unions that currently exist as opposed to salt for new ones? Like, I'm not against salting for new ones, but like, if that's the only way you can grow, it means that your growth is really going to be shallow, and then a lot of people are going to be disillusioned by union politics, because what you're saying is that union politics is only appealing to places that aren't unionized. Because people that are unionized, even though their shop density is like at 30% or less, unions don't have appeal to them. That's what you're actually saying, which seems to me to be a pretty, to bring it back to what we were talking about at the beginning, decadent position.
Yeah.
I mean, the greatest irony right now is unions have never been more popular and less people in them. Like,
I mean, some people would say, and not entirely unjustly, would say that's not a bad place to be, because that means that there's potential
room for growth.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I don't see anyone adjusting their strategies around it.
Well, because you'd have to admit that one, Starbucks unions are never going to be as much capture as an industrial union, and two, the organic composition of capital, a la Aaron Benev and Marx himself, And automation means that you don't have large fucking factories to recruit from, which is why all the powerful unions are in the goddamn public sector and are being crushed by the government now anyway.
Yeah.
So go fuck yourselves. That's all I have to say about it.
We should end with that.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, speaking of, we do need to wrap up soon.
okay,
Yeah.
we can wrap up. I was gonna go through the various critiques. I'm just gonna say this. Aufhebung themselves, before, I think in debates with Theory Communiste, which is famous, I guess, for the debates that caused the Endnotes Collective to exist. But Theory Communiste saw decadence as a period of the cycle of struggle, where the working class saw itself as a positive force within capitalism. They pushed Aufhebung to move towards a theory of communization, where the revolution is the immediate destruction of the proletarian condition as a whole, but also so no longer any transition. But also, this meant for communization theorists an abandonment of the working class as a universal subject. That's where that goes. If you don't get to Endnotes Volume 4, A History of Separation, where they basically said not only were the bourgeois revolution fakes, but the workers' movement was fake too. Which I just think is false. I'm like, no, there was actually a workers' movement.
Yeah, I think that's false. Also, I think maybe just for anybody listening who's like, whatever. I just want to set the record straight about something. We're all, I think, very pro-labor, very pro-union.
Yes. I'm in a union. I'm a fucking union rep.
It's just that when we vent our frustrations about the state of the unions and then we laugh, that's like dark humor from a World War I soldier coming back. It's like we're talking about something that sucks. We're not talking about it as a good thing.
Right.
I'm not a cancel communist who thinks that we shouldn't be dealing with actually existing labor unions, because I think the actual existing labor unions are all we have.
Yeah.
I also will tell you that they're in a much worse state, though, than what Jacobin magazine will tell you that they're in.
Yeah.
And
that's right.
And I actually get very angry with the refusal of, American Democratic Socialists to be honest about the leadership and state of the labor union. I think we're actively dishonest about it.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would consider myself Democratic Socialist, but in so much that I am, I guess because I do think democracy is okay and I am a socialist, but in so much that I am, we're not in a great space. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. It's not going to be one of our longer episodes because we started late and everyone's got stuff to do. I think this essay is interesting to me because while it's a critique of economism and decadence, it has an economistic definition of decadence. And I think its last 3 paragraph conclusion is actually true, but it's too harsh on people who wanted to understand, the internal dynamics of capitalism. Because I can believe that there's internal dynamics of capitalism, but if the working class are if socialists don't merge with the working class and the workers don't become more aware of their position in history and start overcoming their sectoral divisions and acting together, I just think things are going to continue to get worse. And the thing I remind myself to tie this back to our discussions on No Royal Road before we get into Decadence Theory Conservative Edition, is that you can have a mode of production just fucking fail, and not have a revolution, or the revolution be a long drawn out 500-year process because the other mode failed.
Right.
Yes.
By the time we know what feudalism is, and if it even existed, it was already over.
Yeah.
That's what I learned from the Chris Wickham stuff. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah, yeah.
proletarian. If we can say that the proletarian revolution is an objectively existing thing,
mhm.
it's the first transition from one mode of production to another mode of production, which is conceived of in advance. It's the first
Right.
one ever,
Yeah.
which I think might be one of our problems.
Well, I mean, that is where I think there is a problem here, is that Marx actually, the gambit on socialism becomes the first self-aware man controlling history, as opposed to man stumbling into revolutions by accident. And one of the things that I've struggled with on this decadence stuff, if decadence prompts us to revolution, is it a self-awareness? And then if that's the case, do we have like if the economists are right, then we might be in some like shitty 400-year transition into a new mode of production. And even the techno-feudalists are actually optimistic because they can't believe that capitalism could decay this long and this bad, but of course they're wrong.
Yeah, I don't think very many people can countenance the idea that late capitalism is just a very, very long time.
Yeah.
But late feudalism was apparently the longest part of feudalism. Again, if feudalism was even a thing.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm maintain that it was.
Yeah, so like 900 to like 1300 is late feudalism. Like,
it might be the case that 1917, way later in history, when everyone's looking back, we can see 1917 similar to the Chompy Revolt, in that it was an early, basically a proto part of
Russia
what
is our
eventually
Florentine Republic.
Yes.
Like Soviet Russia is our Florentine Republic. That's kind of depressing, though.
It is.
Because that means we're in for a long haul.
We've only got about 300 or 400 years of capitalism left. That's all.
Yeah. Hell, that's more time than we have
left to live on this planet at this rate.
I was gonna say, we have more time for the mode of production to run itself out than we have life on the planet Earth.
Well, I mean, this is my thing. Is sometimes this is my eco-socialist bit kicks in, and I'm like, maybe it's the ecology damage that prompts us for the working class to act. And the reason why I have a friend who's always trying to convince me that they're honestly not a Maoist, a libertarian socialist, whatever the fuck that means. That's my favorite. Because it used to mean anarchist, but now it doesn't even mean that. But anyway, I think that he's always trying to convince me that there's still a peasantry, and I'm like, well, I mean, there's still agrarian labor, but no, there's not a fucking subsistence peasantry anywhere on the planet of any significant size. Yes, it still exists, but like even Africa and India are now more urbanized than not.
Yeah, I think that, Mike Davis wrote the book Planet of Slums, and I think he marked the year 2005 as the first time in history when more people lived in an urban environment and worked in some kind of an industrial or industrially adjacent sector of society than at any other point in history. It's the very first time whenever agrarian societies became the minority, and that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, and it's only become more so the case.
Yeah.
We have returned to 19th century work conditions in that informal and piece labor has replaced formal employment as the dominant node of employment on the planet. Even in becoming that way here, because so many people are contractors now.
Yeah.
I do think this leads us to an interesting problem. Now, if I was going to make a really long series, I would now say I'm now going to discuss all the answers to the various interpretations of the law of the rate of profits to fall that aren't decadence theory. And that will be the next 50 episodes. Because for those of you who don't see my notes, and the only people who see my notes is me, we're about a third of the way through my notes because I took on all the economic responses to this. To not specifically to this, but like the people who brought up stuff that wasn't included in the Aufhebung critique, and that actually quadrupled the size of my notes. So we're not going to do that today, and probably never going to do that. It might be a Von Vlog supplement one day, who knows? But we're going to start talking about the conservative view of decadence, because in reading some of these post-liberal decadence books, I have been led to a observation made by Christopher Lasch in 1987 in his debates in Tikkun magazine, where he said, for the working class, the left often is in denial of the problems that the working class has, and the right acknowledges them but gives bullshit answers. And I have been very much, particularly in like watching someone like Ross Doodhat and stuff celebrate Trump, the very manifestation of every condition of decadence that he is writing about in his book on decadence. Like, I mean, you know, these are people who talk about renewing Western civilization by, I don't know, legalizing gambling. And prediction markets and shit. Like,
Donald Trump is like, he's the guy who's at the forefront of legalizing unrestricted gambling. He's the guy who's talking about
who has tagged crypto into the actual formal financial market in such a way that crypto is going to crash.
Right. He's doing H-1Bs, but only for people who do OnlyFans. Donald Trump is the most decadent president. He's the most vice driven dominated president that the United States has ever seen.
And the only other one I can think of that's close to him is Warren Harding. That's how far you got to go back. Yeah. Like, and even then I was like, man, the Teapot Dome scandal just seems so quaint.
Yeah, it really does.
Fuck, Watergate seems quaint. Watergate seems really quaint.
Compared to the Epstein files, yeah.
Yeah.
God, the Epstein files is basically like every disgusting sex thriller that you saw in the 90s about how evil a large part of the ruling class is apparently true.
Yeah.
The files.
Just about every conspiracy theory is partially correct except for the flat earth one.
Although I will admit that one of the unfortunate effects of the Epstein files is like now everyone is a conspiracy theory about everything, including things that are not in there. Well, so
yeah,
like the number of people who think we're led by satanic cannibals because of the Epstein files, I'm like, there isn't evidence for that other than jokes. And Epstein was a sicko, so his sense of humor was fucked.
I mean, there's allegations, but there is no evidence.
Right, and the allegations are in the part that aren't. Then the part that they released because they weren't particularly
believable,
right. Salient. I actually think that they released some of the most ridiculous allegations first, so that people won't be paying attention to how bad the shit and the rest of the 92% that we don't have access to, apparently. Thank you, UK, because these foreign findings are actually saying how much they're actually holding back. Holy shit. There's something like 15 terabytes of data on Epstein.
Yep. I think that even without any of the most outlandish without any of the most outlandish conspiracy theories to come out of it and the craziest allegations, you still do have a
pedophile cabal tied to every intelligence agency of any size on the planet.
Yep. And
Epstein doesn't seem to have been anyone's agent, but he was an asset for at least 4 different fucking countries. So
right. I mean, and I don't think we have to even mention who the one he was closest tied to.
Yeah, it wasn't us.
It wasn't us, and it certainly wasn't Russia. So if anyone has that idea in their head, they've swallowed bullshit propaganda very readily.
The Israelis, then us, then the Gulf states, then the British, then the Russians are implicated too, but they're like number 6 or 7. Like,
well,
and also the Russians ties to this are thin, and they're also back when the Russians and the Israelis were playing better together. So,
and they're also not through official channels.
No,
they're through like dissident MPs in the Duma and stuff like that.
No, we don't have a handler for Mossad and Epstein, so we can't say that he was an agent. But we can say he was an asset, and that they bugged his fucking house because who Barack was hanging out over there so much. And I like to remind people that Ehud Barak is on the Israeli center left.
That's great. Yeah.
Oh,
he is one of the more reasonable genocidal fucking pedophiles. That
I was actually telling someone
Israel.
It was Sean KB when I was like, there are different versions of Jewish supremacy fighting themselves out in this text, and I hate to say it, but you guys are so not taught about this, about different visions of what Israelis think, the religious versus the secular, blah blah blah, that you can't even recognize that there are multiple different forms of this represented in the Epstein files, and the secular one is the one that is winning out with Epstein, but there's actually internal debates going on here, and it's gross. I mean, I will say this. I'm not full Zog occupied government, not just because it's a Nazi conspiracy, but I will tell you that I'm closer than I used to be.
I think we all are.
Yeah.
I think we are all. We've shifted in our conception of how much pull Israel has over the U.S. government. I don't think Israel controls the U.S. government, but I think they have an outsized impact on our foreign policy based on the people that they have bought or blackmailed, I guess.
Also, I'm going to say this: the Gulf states are way more corrupt than I even thought. I'll leave it at that. Like,
that is fucking impressive too.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Like,
and
that's another thing that comes up in those files. Oh my god!
What no one's talking about is the enormous number of financial crimes that are revealed in these.
They
just don't register.
Yeah, I was about to say the shit that I was horrified by is one. I mean, you want to talk about the literal like proof of how bad it got in the post-Soviet Eastern Europe. It's just what you read the Epstein files and you're just, oh fuck, man.
Yeah, like, there's Events in Ukraine did an article about Epstein's sort of like looting of human capital in the form of Ukrainian and Russian young women and girls.
Yeah, I mean, they also did it to Latin America and the brown parts, but they were definitely willing to do it to the post-Soviets.
Yeah.
It's
anyway, just to indulge in a little bit of conspiranoia, he did order 300 gallons of sulfuric acid to his island, and there's a trap door that leads to the ocean. I think some people were getting murdered in there, and I don't know who they were, but that is fucking horrifying.
I will. I mean, there's also an accusation of at least 4 people buried in Trump golf courses that no one's ever investigated. And I'm like, you think they'd even encourage to investigate it because that would be really easily disproven.
No, Zorro Ranch too.
No, they definitely. A bunch of girls definitely. I'm not gonna say definitely. It is statistically very likely that a bunch of young women died.
Yes, very likely.
Well,
I'll leave it at that.
It's a very, very awful note to end it on, but
well, I mean, you want to talk about proof of fucking decadence? The
Yeah.
fact that
Decadence, depravity.
no one's in prison for that in this country. I mean, the fact that the British arrested a royal and we haven't arrested anybody after Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell is proof of decadence enough. Like, sorry, it's where I'm at. All right, and on that note,
we're at bare minimum, we're supposed to have equality in the eyes of the law, regardless of class, right? Yep, bare minimum.
Yeah. They're not even trying.
What a fucking
to
joke!
Shit anymore.
What a fucking joke! They don't even pretend anymore.
No.
The bourgeois
British,
project is dead.
The British are doing a better job of I mean, if anything, like, isn't this what we had a revolution about? Like, no, I know not really, but if we were to believe the propaganda, isn't this what we had a revolution about? Anyway, yes, the bourgeois project is dead. And I'm not going lulling the bourgeois project because fuck that. All right. See you guys later.